one note lingered, long after the keys were still. Welcome to Mystery's Notebook. I am your host, Elspeth. Comment below and let me know where you're tuning in. Your words mean so much. The story begins. The afternoon sun slanted across the polished oak floors of the Chipping Dean Village Hall, filling the air with a mellow gold. The occasion was the annual Autumn Charity Concert, a genteel affair much beloved by the locals. Lace-trimmed programs rested on laps, the scent of chrysanthemums drifted in from the vases flanking the stage, and a low hum of polite conversation rippled through the audience. Miss Jane Marple, dressed in dove-grey wool with a small hat of navy felt, sat 3 rows from the front. She had attended every concert for the last 9 years, not out of any deep passion for music, though she appreciated a pleasant melody, but because such gatherings offered a fine opportunity to observe people without the burden of conversation. This year's program had been a predictable mixture of the familiar and the mildly ambitious, a young soprano attempting Puccini, the vicar's wife at the harp, and a quartet of local schoolgirls singing madrigals slightly out of tune. But the highlight, so everyone insisted, was to be the performance by Mr. Lionel Ainsworth, the village's most refined resident, a man who had once, according to gossip, played for royalty in his youth. When Lionel took his seat at the grand piano, the room seemed to lean forward. He was a tall man, his hair silvered but abundant, his manner faintly theatrical. The first piece, a delicate Chopin nocturne, was executed with admirable finesse, the notes falling like slow, clear drops of rain. Applause was generous, though Lionel, with a gracious bow, behaved as though he were indulging a less discerning audience than he deserved. It was in his second piece, however, that the incident occurred. A bright and lively sonata, light as champagne, was progressing agreeably when, midway through, Lionel struck a note that seemed to hang unnaturally in the air. It lingered, just a heartbeat too long, before the melody resumed. At first, no one seemed to notice. A wrong note here, a pause there, were hardly crimes in the eyes of Chipping Dean's forgiving audience. But Miss Marple, whose eyes were rarely fixed on the music, happened to be watching Lionel's face at that exact moment. His expression had flickered, just for an instant, from poised concentration to something like shock. And then, as quickly as it came, the mask returned. When the piece ended, he rose to more applause, but his bow was shorter, his shoulders slightly tense. Miss Marple tilted her head, filing away the image. She had lived long enough to know that the smallest changes, a hesitation in speech, a glance in the wrong direction, often heralded the most significant truths. The evening continued as planned. Tea was poured, shortbread passed around, and the piano lid was lowered with care. But as people gathered their coats and exchanged pleasantries, there was an unmistakable stir near the side door. Mrs. Evans, the postmistress, came hurrying in, her face pale. She whispered something to the vicar, who blanched, excused himself from a knot of parish ladies, and disappeared into the passage. A murmur spread like a slow wave through the hall. Miss Marple caught the words, "collapsed in the green room," and "call Dr. Pembroke," before the vicar reappeared, looking grave. By the time Miss Marple reached the doorway, Lionel Ainsworth was lying motionless on the faded rug of the green room, the tea tray overturned beside him. One hand still reached faintly toward the piano keys in the corner, as if the music had not quite finished playing in his mind. They waited for the doctor with the hushed obedience of churchgoers before a sermon, filling the corridor with restrained whispers and the soft shuffle of wet autumn shoes on linoleum. Miss Marple stood slightly aside, as if contemplating a thread that had snagged on the green room's door jamb. She noticed, because she always did, the small things. The tea slopping from the upturned cup had made a fan of brown across the rug. A half slice of lemon lay face down like a little coin. The vicar's hand, holding his spectacles, trembled in a very un-vicar-like manner. Mr. Lionel Ainsworth did not move, His skin had taken on that curious dimness which is not quite pallor, but its more confident cousin. Dr. Pembroke arrived with a briskness that suggested irritation at having been called out during his own pudding. He went down on one knee, then two, his bag in a neat triangle beside him. He touched the carotid with 2 fingers and frowned untheatrically. A cuff was unbuttoned, a stethoscope's cold mouth pressed to a shirt front, and the room held its breath, as though it had learned the habit from the audience in the hall. "Gone," the doctor said, very quietly. The word spread out through the doorway and along the corridor, dividing itself among ears like a loaf for the 5,000. There is in small places a practical, almost industrious grief. Men went to fetch blankets that would never be used, and women offered to make tea as if the warm society of it might contradict the body on the rug. The vicar murmured a prayer under his breath, eyes lowered, while Mrs. Evans, the postmistress, stood very straight, as if taking down an important telegram. Miss Marple did not join the bustle. She bent rather slowly, as old ladies do, and righted the saucer with delicate fingers. The underside had a chip. It was hardly unusual for crockery in a village hall. Still, she set the cup upon it with a care that might have seemed excessive if one did not know she had, all her life, believed that respect for small things was an insurance against larger catastrophes. She glanced, only glanced, at the teapot. Its spout had dribbled on the cloth, and the ring of wet there formed a slightly darker crescent than the rest. She took in the sugar bowl. 2 tongs, not one. The cheap kind that lose their spring. One lay half beneath the folded programme. There were 4 used cups and 2 unused. That was interesting, chiefly because 5 people were said to have been in and out of the green room between Lionel's second piece and his collapse. Lionel himself, of course. Mrs. Breyer, the hall mistress. Young Mr. Rudd, the schoolmaster who tuned the piano with a solemnity out of proportion to his talent. Mrs. Claire Pembroke, the doctor's wife, who had helped bring in the better biscuits from the vicarage. And Gwendolen Pike, whose soprano had strained Puccini at the beginning of the evening and who had, by general consensus, a way of being where she shouldn't. A policeman was required. In due time, Sergeant Abel Cray, who had a tidy mind for regulations and a hearty distrust of anomalies, arrived and made a series of remarks about procedures which comforted him more than anyone else. He took names, and in taking them, produced the usual harvest. People everywhere respond to the shadow of tragedy by cultivating explanations, like cress, on wet blotting paper. Mrs. Evans was quick to inform Sergeant Cray, and thus everyone within reach, that Lionel had been under strain, dear, which might have meant anything from money troubles to constipation. Mr. Lathbury, from the grocer's, whose hearing was poor and his confidence excellent, announced that he'd always said Lionel kept ungodly hours, a fact deduced solely from seeing a light in Lionel's window once at 10:30. "Let us have quiet," Sergeant Cray said, and the command, much like the vicar's prayers, performed admirably without producing miracles. Miss Marple offered a chair. The sergeant declined, then took it without noticing he had changed his mind. He asked about the tea. Dr. Pembroke, who remained, said mildly that there was nothing to be done. Mr. Ainsworth had been dead when he arrived. Any further examinations would be for the coroner. He did not, Miss Marple observed, pronounce on cause. Good doctors in villages are careful men. They let the next official speak the next official word. In the hall, people began to leave in 2s and 3s, held up at the vestibule by a human bottleneck of soft condolence. As they went, the narrative, already born, grew and divided. One version had Lionel suffer a weak heart. Another preferred stroke, a term with the tidy finality of a door softly closing. A livelier story, tripping along from lips happy to be consulted, had him nervy of late because of a letter, anonymous, naturally, telling him to give up the concert. This last may have been a fancy, but fancies in villages are often early drafts of truthful things, and Miss Marple, who had seen truth and invention court and quarrel too many times to be impressed, made a mental note to ask, when appropriate, about Lionel's post. She, waited until the room contained only those who had a reason to be there. The sergeant, the doctor, the vicar, Mrs. Briar, who stood with her hands clamped in front of her like a guard at the palace, and Miss Marple herself. Also present, rather less appropriately, was Gwendolen Pike, who had not quite learned that lingering is as revealing as leaving. "Miss Pike," said Sergeant Cray, eyeing her, "you assisted in the green room earlier?" "I brought in the fresh napkins," she said, with a touching air of usefulness, "and the nicer biscuits, the ones with the jam window. Who poured the tea?" "Mrs. Briar," Gwendolen said promptly. "But Mr. Ainsworth said he preferred lemon in the evening, so I sliced one." "Did you hand him his cup?" Gwendolen looked at the teapot as if it might supply a kinder answer. "I don't quite recall. He was talking to Mr. Rudd about the soft pedal. Something about it catching. Mrs. Briar did pass a cup to him, I think." "The soft pedal," said the sergeant, writing. "Catching." "It sometimes does," Mr. Rudd put in, appearing in the doorway with a shy eagerness, like a dog who knows a trick. "The una corda can stick on that old Broadwood. I told the committee we ought to service it properly, but they think tuning is a luxury as it is." He looked embarrassed. "Just now and then, it lingers when you lift your foot, like a breath that doesn't quite end." A note that lasted too long. Miss Marple, who did not care overmuch for the physics of pianos but understood very well the physics of people, felt the first small thread draw taut between things that had seemed unconnected. The held note, the flicker of shock on Lionel's face, the preference for lemon in the evening. Not proof, oh no, but the little seeds from which proof sometimes grows. "Mrs. Briar," said the sergeant. "Who else came in here after Mr. Ainsworth's second piece?" Mrs. Briar, all municipal righteousness, listed them. In her voice, the green room became a railway junction, and she its station master. Mr. Ainsworth, of course, Miss Pike, Mr. Rudd, myself, Mrs. Pembroke for the extra biscuits, and the vicar peeped in to remark about the hymn choice for next week, but didn't stay. And, oh, Mrs. Evans for a telegram. She flushed. I mean, she came looking for the vicar, some urgent matter about a parcel for the manor. "That was earlier, Mrs. Briar," the vicar said gently, "before the performance began." "Ah, well, I'm quite put out." "Quite," said Miss Marple kindly. "Did Mr. Ainsworth eat or drink anything?" the sergeant asked. "Tea," said Mrs. Briar. "With lemon. He said sugar would make his fingers heavy. Musicians," she added, with a touch of disapproval, "have their little ways." Dr. Pembroke, who had been silent, looked up. "You will want the cup," he said to Cray, "and the lemon." Cray nodded, gratified by the doctor's endorsement of order. He made little parcels of evidence with a thoroughness that would have delighted the Home Office. The cup, the saucer, the lemon, the tongs, even the crumb-speckled plate of the jam window biscuits, each secured in paper as though a modest gift. "Natural causes are still possible," he announced, to reassure himself. "But we will allow the coroner to confirm." "Quite right," Miss Marple murmured, and thought how often men pronounce possible when they mean comforting. They walked back into the hall. The air had cooled and grown cavernous with emptiness. Programs lay like shed leaves. On the stage, the piano sat with its lid lowered, transformed by circumstance into a creature pretending to sleep. Mr. Rudd hovering near it was the sort of man to stroke a piano when sad, and he did, foolishly and tenderly, as if apologizing for the unfairness of mortality. Miss Marple's eyes drifted to the little felt wedge that someone, some sensible caretaker, had slid between the lid and the fallboard to keep it from slamming. Sensible people, she reflected, leave traces that are as informative as the reckless ones. "Miss Marple," said Gwendolen, who had followed her as the young will follow the wise without understanding why. Do you think it was simply his time?" Miss Marple was not the sort of woman to make melodrama of death. "It is always someone's time," she said gently. The question is whether the hour was chosen for him or by him. Gwendolen swallowed. There was something in her manner, an earnestness overlaid by a little theatre, that Miss Marple had seen before in girls who want to seem older, cleverer, indispensable to some older man's circle. It often ends in tears, sometimes in lies. He could be very particular, Gwendolen went on. He did not like people touching his music. He said my phrasing was gauche. But he was kind about it after. Kind in a manner that made you feel you'd been scolded and comforted at the same time. Powerful men often discover that kindness, properly delivered, is an instrument, Miss Marple said. Did he ever play duets with you? Gwendolen's cheeks coloured. Once. He said we might, if I kept my tempo. We practised at his cottage. Only once. Ah. Sergeant Cray rejoined them, his notebook more filled and his mind not much clearer. We'll seal the green room for the night, he said. Doctor, you'll notify the coroner. Vicar, perhaps you'll lock the hall. Miss Marple. He paused, because even tidy-minded men think twice before presuming to direct certain old ladies. If you noticed anything. Oh, I noticed a great deal, Miss Marple said amiably, but it may be that most of it is embroidery. Best keep embroidery to yourself for now, Cray said, then softened. No offence meant. None taken in the least. They parted. Outside, the village had put on its night things, the lamplight golden in puddles, the hedges black shapes with wet sparkle, the smell of damp earth rising like an old memory. People moved along High Street as they always did, only slower, as if the cobbles had lately been greased with solemnity. Pairs stopped, heads together. Curtains twitched. Doors opened just long enough to receive a sentence and close on it again. Mr. Lathbury told the baker that Lionel had been as good as dead for months, which relieved Mr. Lathbury because it made him write about something. The baker, who had always disliked Lionel's habit of tapping the counter to a rhythm while ordering, found himself mouthing sympathy and feeling privately that a certain irritation in the village had been removed. Miss Marple walked at her usual pace. She passed the red pillar box outside the post office and thought, as one does, of letters posted and letters kept in drawers. The house called Greystones, where Lionel rented rooms, sat somewhat apart, half hidden by a cotonista laden with red berries. Its upstairs window, the room with the piano, showed no light. She remembered the gossip about him. A man of means once, an impresario's promise in his youth, a midlife marriage that had not taken root, rumours of students who adored him past good sense. He had returned to villages the way some birds return to hedgerows after the grand experiment of cities. At her gate, she paused. There was no harm, she decided, in a little detour. She went on, 2 doors further, and turned up the short path to Mrs. Evans's neat cottage. The postmistress answered in her apron, as if she had been waiting behind the door for the knock. Oh, Miss Marple, dreadful business. I'm that shaken. Cup of cocoa. Another time, dear. I wondered, purely because curiosity is a weed in me that resists pruning, whether Mr. Ainsworth ever received letters that required, well, sorting out. Mrs. Evans's eyes brightened professionally. He gets letters, yes, same as anybody. More than some, with that handwriting from London, tall and thin, on blue paper. And a foreign one now and then. Postmark from Bologna I noticed last month, because I notice. One does in the line. And any that were, how shall I put it, unpleasant. Not to say. There was a postcard last week with no return, picture of the Albert Hall. You are a fraud. Oh, I shouldn't. But it's as good as public a postcard is, I told him. He laughed, but not like he meant it. Thank you, Mrs. Evans. You were always a mine of order in a world of confusion. Back in her own cottage, Miss Marple set the kettle and put 1 biscuit on a plate, which is the exact number of biscuits a sensible woman of her years will allow herself at such an hour. She sat by the fire with her knitting and let, as she always did, the noise of the day settle until what remained was not noise at all, but pattern. A note that lasted too long. A piano's soft pedal sticking. Yes, that happened. But Lionel's face in that moment had been frightened, not annoyed. Fear recognized fear in Miss Marple as surely as a hound recognizes a scent. Lemon in the evening, sugar refused. A habit? Very likely. Habits provide cover. If one wished to introduce something into a man's tea unnoticed, one might prefer sugar because it is anonymous. But lemon is a more civilized subterfuge because it is conspicuous in the right way. One expects lemon to be different, to alter the taste. And the tongs, 2 pairs, one gone soft, one sprung. People who are nervous of their own deeds sometimes over-provide the very tools by which they mean to carry them out. She thought, too, of Gwendolen with her flushed cheeks and her ache to be approved, and of Mr. Rudd with his tidy, resentful knowledge of a neglected piano. She even allowed herself, for fairness, to consider Mrs. Pembroke, brisk and capable, whose life was a braided rope of other people's crises, and who might, if pressed too far, long to pull it sharply. The village was full of such little tensions, never murderous by themselves. But align 3 or 4 dear little pressures in a line, and you have, Miss Marple knew, something not unlike a fuse. The clock on the mantel struck 10. In the quiet that followed, she heard the faintest echo of the hall, the opening bars of the Chopin nocturne. Then, unbidden, that single suspended note. She set down her knitting and looked into the fire until the pattern formed more clearly. Not a conclusion, no, but a contour. In the morning, she would call on Greystones. She would admire very sincerely the roses. She would sympathize very gently with the charwoman. And she would ask, as if the thought had just arrived on a sparrow's wing, whether Mr. Ainsworth kept any medicinal powders for his digestion, and whether his knife for slicing lemons had lately gone blunt. Morning brought a thin mist that clung to the hedgerows and curled lazily along the cobbles of High Street, muting the colours of the shop fronts and blurring the lines between pavement and verge. Miss Marple, who rose early more from habit than necessity, opened her curtains to find the world muffled and still, as though the village had drawn a blanket about its shoulders. She dressed in her customary layers, a pale blouse, cardigan buttoned sensibly, and a soft tweed skirt, and allowed herself the luxury of a second cup of tea before setting out. Greystones, Lionel Ainsworth's residence, was a handsome, slightly aloof house, set back from the lane behind a wrought-iron gate and framed by 2 thick rose bushes. The roses, in their last bloom before winter, drooped with moisture. Miss Marple paused to admire them, as she had resolved, bending slightly to examine a particularly deep, crimson bloom. The act, as she well knew, allowed for a slow survey of the front windows. The curtains in the music room remained drawn, though the faint shadow of the grand piano's lid could be seen through the fabric. The front door was opened by Mrs. Nash, the housekeeper, a woman of small frame but brisk authority. She looked as though she had been startled out of her morning chores. "Oh, Miss Marple. Yes, I suppose you'd be calling. We're in a terrible way, we are. I've hardly slept." Miss Marple offered a sympathetic smile. "Quite understandable, my dear. Such a sudden loss must leave a house unsettled. I thought I might pay my respects, and perhaps trouble you for a word or two about Mr. Ainsworth's last evening." Mrs. Nash stepped back to admit her, leading the way into a narrow hall with polished floorboards and a lingering scent of furniture polish. The air held that particular hush that follows a death in a house, the sense that one must tread lightly, as if the walls themselves were listening. They settled in the small sitting room off the hall, where the curtains had been drawn back to admit the pale light. Mrs. Nash, in the manner of someone grateful for distraction, fetched tea. Miss Marple noted the service, an everyday set, pale green with a thin gold rim, the cups slightly mismatched from years of careful replacements. "I can't tell you much about yesterday," Mrs. Nash began, settling herself opposite. Mr. Ainsworth was out most of the day, said he had business in St. Mary Mead, returned in time to change for the concert, always liked to look his best for an audience. And did he dine before going out? Miss Marple asked mildly, stirring her tea without looking up. A little soup and bread, nothing more. He never ate much before performing, said it dulled the mind. Afterwards, though, he liked a proper supper. I'd left cold roast and pickles in the pantry for when he came back. She paused. Only he didn't, of course. Miss Marple made a small, regretful sound. Did he keep any medicines in the house? Powders for digestion, perhaps? Mrs. Nash frowned slightly, as though unsure if such details were proper to discuss. A few things. A bottle of something for his nerves. Herbal, from the chemist. And those little white tablets for his stomach. Took them after rich food. He said they kept the bile at bay. Tablets in a tin or a bottle. In a bottle. Stoppered tight. Why? Oh, merely curious. These little domestic arrangements often matter more than one expects. Miss Marple took a sip of tea. And the knife for slicing lemons, would it be in the kitchen? Mrs. Nash nodded. It would. Mr. Ainsworth was particular about it. Thin blade, kept in a drawer all its own. He claimed a poor cut ruined the flavour. Miss Marple rose with an apologetic smile. Might I see it? In the kitchen, the knife was produced. A slender blade with a worn wooden handle. It was clean, though the faint scent of lemon lingered. The edge, when Miss Marple brushed a fingertip along it, was indeed blunt. Too blunt for so exacting a man to tolerate for long. Curious, she murmured. Mrs. Nash looked puzzled. It needs sharpening, that's true. I meant to see to it, but Mr. Ainsworth hadn't mentioned it. He always did if something was amiss. Miss Marple let the remark hang in the air, as though it were a garment waiting to be claimed, then thanked Mrs. Nash for her time and made her way back into the lane. The mist was lifting, revealing the soft green of the hedges and the distant silhouette of the church spire. She walked toward the high street, intending to call at the vicarage. The vicar, Reverend Latham, was in his study, surrounded by a clutter of books and the faint smell of pipe tobacco. He received Miss Marple warmly, if a little distractedly. A dreadful business, Miss Marple, he said, removing his spectacles and rubbing the bridge of his nose. I can't quite believe it. Lionel was, well, a character, but the village will feel his absence. I imagine so, Miss Marple said. And yet I wonder, did you find him troubled of late? The vicar hesitated. Not openly, but there was the matter of the letter. Ah, Miss Marple said, as if the detail were only vaguely familiar. Mrs. Evans mentioned something about an anonymous note. Reverend Latham nodded. A postcard, actually. Arrived last week. Unpleasant in tone. Accused him of deceit. Lionel brushed it off when I asked, said the work of some jealous amateur. But he was quieter after that. More inward. And you saw him in the green room last night? Briefly. I stepped in to ask about the hymn choice for next Sunday. He seemed perfectly composed then. We spoke for less than a minute. Miss Marple rose, thanking him for his time. As she left the vicarage, she caught sight of Sergeant Cray approaching along the lane, notebook in hand. Morning, Miss Marple, he said, tipping his hat. You've been busy, I see. Merely visiting friends, Sergeant. Have you news? Nothing definite. The coroner will examine the body today. But I did find something in the green room, tucked behind the tea tray. A small paper twist, the sort chemists use for powders. Empty, of course. He glanced at her. Could be nothing. Or could be something, Miss Marple said mildly. You will let me know what the coroner discovers. Of course. And Miss Marple. He lowered his voice. I'd appreciate it if you'd share any of your impressions. Quietly. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Oh, Sergeant, I should be quite useless if I were anything but quiet. They parted, and Miss Marple continued along the lane, her thoughts turning over the fragments she had gathered. The blunt lemon knife, the paper twist, the postcard with its sharp accusation. They were like the opening bars of a tune, disparate notes, waiting for the melody that would connect them. At the corner by the baker's, she encountered Gwendolen Pike, emerging with a loaf under her arm and a look of restless curiosity. "Oh, Miss Marple, did you hear? They say the police found something." "People are always finding something," Miss Marple replied. "The trick is knowing whether it was meant to be found." Gwendolen flushed as though the remark touched a private thought. "I keep thinking, perhaps if I'd been more attentive in the green room." "My dear, remorse is an indulgence unless it's tied to action," Miss Marple said gently. "Better to remember precisely what you saw and heard, even the smallest thing." Gwendolen hesitated. "Well, when I sliced the lemon, I noticed one half was missing, already gone from the plate before I came in. I assumed Mr. Ainsworth had used it earlier, but now—" She trailed off. "Now you are not so sure." "No," Gwendolen admitted. "And the tongs. Mrs. Breyer gave me one pair, but I saw another lying by the biscuits. I didn't think it mattered." "It often doesn't," Miss Marple said, "until it does." She left Gwendolen at the corner, her mind already working ahead. If one half of the lemon had been removed earlier, it could have been prepared, treated, in advance. The blunt knife would disguise a cut made by another blade, and the powder's absence from its paper twist suggested it had been introduced to something moist, where it would dissolve unseen. By the time Miss Marple reached her own garden gate, the mist had burned away, leaving the village in the clear, sharp light of late morning. It was a light in which small things stood out with uncomfortable clarity, and in that light, she saw the outlines of something darker forming just at the edges of the picture. A motive, perhaps, still blurred, but slowly coming into focus. By early afternoon, the village had settled into the curious rhythm that follows a death in public view, half the population going about their errands with feigned normality, the other half inventing reasons to be near the centre of events. Miss Marple, having pruned a few deadheads from her roses, slipped on her hat and coat once more. There were still two people whose roles in the evening's drama seemed insufficiently illuminated. Mrs. Pembroke, with her efficient manner and brisk comings and goings, and Mr. Rudd, the earnest schoolmaster whose preoccupation with the piano had struck her as both genuine and oddly intense. She chose to begin with the Pembrokes, whose house stood a few doors beyond the post office. Mrs. Pembroke answered herself, her apron freshly laundered and her sleeves rolled to the elbow. She had the look of a woman interrupted in the midst of tidying a kitchen that didn't need tidying. "Oh, Miss Marple, do come in. I expect you're here about poor Mr. Ainsworth." She spoke as though the matter, while tragic, was an administrative inconvenience to be managed with proper files and labels. Miss Marple allowed herself to be guided into a sitting room that smelled faintly of lavender polish. "It is a sad business, my dear. I thought I might trouble you for your recollection of the green room last night. One hears so many versions, it's as well to gather them from the source." Mrs. Pembroke nodded briskly. "Of course. I went in after his second piece, when there was a little interval before the next performance. Mrs. Breyer had mentioned the biscuits from the vicarage, so I brought them along on a tray. Lionel, Mr. Ainsworth, was speaking to Mr. Rudd about the piano pedals, something technical I didn't follow. Miss Pike was by the refreshments, cutting lemon, I believe. I set down the biscuits and went back out. I was in the room no more than a minute." "And you poured no tea yourself?" "No, Mrs. Breyer had that in hand. I'm sure she gave him a cup. I saw it in his hand as I left." Miss Marple's knitting bag smile remained in place. "And how did he seem? His mood?" Mrs. Pembroke's brow furrowed. "Calm enough, though perhaps a touch distracted. Not ill, certainly. His colour was good. I've seen him pale with nerves before a performance, but not last night." Miss Marple thanked her, declining an offer of tea, and made her way toward the schoolhouse. The small classroom windows looked out over the lane, and inside she found Mr. Rudd stacking exercise books. He was a slight man, with the narrow, hunched shoulders of one accustomed to leaning over desks. "Miss Marple, yes, I heard you'd been making inquiries." He spoke quickly, as though to reassure himself of his own willingness to cooperate. "I was hoping you might tell me a little more about your conversation with Mr. Ainsworth yesterday evening," she said gently. Mr. Rudd straightened a pile of books unnecessarily. "It was about the piano. I'd noticed the soft pedal sticking, you see, the una corda. Told him it needed a proper service, but the committee, well, you know how they are. He agreed, but he didn't seem inclined to push the matter. Said he could manage for one night." "And did you touch the instrument before or after his performance?" His eyes flickered. "Before, yes. I checked the pedals, tried the action. After the second piece I did go up again for a moment, when the stage was empty. I thought perhaps the damp had swollen the wood and I might ease it." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And in the green room, you took no refreshment?" "No. I rarely eat in the evenings. Though I did step in briefly. Mrs. Pembroke was coming out as I went in. I said something about the pedal, and he, Mr. Ainsworth, laughed. I remember because it was a rather abrupt laugh, and then he looked down at his tea as though he'd remembered something unpleasant." Miss Marple let the moment hang. "Unpleasant?" "I couldn't say. I left soon after." Walking back toward her cottage, she considered the sequence. Mrs. Pembroke entered, left. Mr. Rudd entered soon after, exchanged a few words, and left as well. The lemon was already cut, or half cut, before Gwendolyn's arrival. The knife was blunt. The paper twist had been hidden, but not destroyed. She was not yet ready to fit these fragments into a frame, but the shape of the puzzle was beginning to emerge. It was the sort of thing she had seen before, the work of someone who understood habit and timing, who could rely on a victim's routine as surely as the turning of a clock hand. The following morning, Sergeant Cray appeared at her gate, looking more serious than usual. "The coroner's report is back," he said, accepting her invitation inside. "Cause of death, digitalis poisoning, small dose over time, building up in the system. Last night's tea seems to have tipped it over the edge." "Digitalis," Miss Marple repeated softly, setting down her knitting. "That is a plant known to the village, I think. Foxglove. Many a garden grows it, and it is both remedy and danger, depending on the measure." Cray nodded. "The doctor says it could have been administered days ago, but the last dose was in that tea. And the cup was given to him by Mrs. Briar." "That's what she says, but anyone could have handled it before it reached him." He sighed. "We've found foxglove leaves in the compost bin behind the hall. That doesn't narrow it down much. Plenty of people had access." Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the fire. "Tell me, Sergeant, this paper twist you found, could it have held powdered digitalis?" He hesitated. "It could, but without residue, we can't prove it." "No," she agreed. "Proof is the business of the police. Pattern is the business of observation." When Cray had gone, she sat for a long while, piecing together the pattern. Digitalis poisoning required patience. It was rarely a crime of sudden passion. Someone had known his habits: lemon in tea, no sugar, a precise sequence of movements between the stage and the green room. Someone had needed the performance as a stage, not for the music, but for the interval, when Lionel would be alone, or nearly so, and no one would think twice about a cup being handed to him. The list of possibilities was shrinking. Gwendolyn, with her eagerness to please, was too impulsive for so measured a crime, unless under influence. Mrs. Briar had opportunity, but not, to Miss Marple's mind, the subtlety. Mrs. Pembroke's movements were efficient, but brief. Mr. Rudd's concern for the piano seemed genuine, yet his access to the stage and the green room was unmatched. And then there was the postcard. "You are a fraud." If the insult were literal, what fraud could a pianist be accused of? Plagiarism, perhaps, or claiming a talent that was waning, or taking credit for another's work. The letter hinted at personal grievance, one that might justify, at least in the mind of the writer, so grave an action. In the fading afternoon light, she opened her small writing desk and took out a notebook. On one page, she wrote the names of those who had been in the green room. Against each, she noted the possible motive: resentment, humiliation, financial gain, jealousy. When she reached Mr. Rudd's name, she paused. A thought, half memory, half deduction, stirred. She had once known a young music teacher in another village who had been furious at the theft of his arrangement by an older, more celebrated performer. The wound had festered for years, until some petty act brought it to light. Miss Marple closed the notebook. The next step, she decided, was to know precisely what Lionel had been doing in the weeks before his death. A pianist's life leaves traces, programs, correspondence, rehearsals, and the truth, she suspected, would be hidden not in the noise of gossip, but in the quiet, routine details Lionel himself had taken for granted. The village, in the meantime, would continue its murmuring, and each person would play their part in the polite theatre of condolence. But somewhere in those carefully measured performances was the one note, too long sustained, that betrayed the hand of the murderer. The fog had burned away by noon, leaving the village so clear-edged that even its gossip looked sharper. Miss Marple crossed High Street with her usual unhurried step, pausing at the post office, not from impatience, but because pausing often brought the world to one. It did so obligingly. Mrs. Evans beckoned her round the side door, with the air of a conspirator whose secret is timed to the minute. "Registered letter for Greystones," she whispered, patting a brown envelope as if it might wriggle. "Foreign stamp, Bologna again. I thought, seeing as how Mrs. Nash gets flustered with signatures, if you happen to be passing." "How fortunate," Miss Marple said, and it was, for fortune often favours those who prepare it gently in advance. "I could carry it along and save her a second trip." Mrs. Evans produced her ledger with solemn pleasure. Miss Marple signed, and a small, satisfying box in the universe was ticked. On the walk to Greystones, she held the envelope at a courteous distance from curiosity. One does not steam open other people's letters, but one notes weight, firmness, the slight warp of several sheets and perhaps a photograph. The corner had a smear as of carbon, typewriter ink, not English somehow. The letters abroad always had a different scent, as if they had kept company with bitter coffee. Mrs. Nash answered at once, flustered indeed until she saw who stood there. "Oh, Miss Marple. Bless you. I was just thinking how on earth I'd fetch it and keep the broth from catching." "Then I shall play Mercury and be thanked for my trouble," Miss Marple smiled. "A letter from Italy, I think." "From that music man," Mrs. Nash said, lowering her voice as if the name itself travelled badly. "Signor somebody, Bianchi. He's written before. Mr. Ainsworth. Never cared to speak of him." "Perhaps now there is business to settle," Miss Marple said gently. Mrs. Nash's fingers worked at the envelope's edge, then stopped. Shouldn't." "Quite right," Miss Marple agreed, and rescued her from the difficult virtue by adding, "There is something else I wondered. Might I, if it is not inconvenient, look in at the music room? The vicar asked me about where to place the flowers for the funeral tea, and it is easier to imagine with one's eyes than one's mind. It was sufficient pretext for a house that had always run on propriety." Mrs. Nash led her down the hall. The music room kept its own climate: polished wood, faint lemon, a thread of cologne that belonged to a man no longer present. The grand stood with its lid closed, a dark beast asleep. On the stand, a neat stack, Chopin Nocturnes, Schubert Impromptus, and above them a sheaf of manuscript tied with cream ribbon. Miss Marple did not touch. She only bent a little, the way one does to admire a baby's fingers without waking it. The title on the first page read, in a slanted, youthful hand, "Three Country Studies" by L.A. The initials were overwritten, An earlier stroke could be seen underneath, ghosting as an R before the L. A small, precise correction, the sort a careful forger makes with honesty about his care, but not about his purpose. "What a handsome room," Miss Marple said aloud. Her gaze drifted to the metronome, set at an odd tempo, 83, not a round number. Beside it lay a pencil stump, an unfamiliar brand to her eye, foreign, with a blue painted end and the word scuola worn almost away. Under the window, a wicker basket with lemon halves, the rinds drying into pale crescents. Tucked beneath them, a grease-proof paper square folded twice, the corner marked with a faint green tinge. Mrs. Nash, who had been watching a visitor watch a room, said quickly, "I clean in here every morning. I hadn't the heart today. It looks as if he might come back for his practice, doesn't it?" "It does," Miss Marple said, and let her hand rest a moment on the piano's fullboard as one touches a shoulder in passing. Outside, the day had the briskness of news in it. She met Sergeant Cray at the gate. He carried an evidence bag with the unlovely confidence of a man who believes plastic can be persuasive. "We went through the hall again," he said. "Found foxglove in the compost, as I told you, and this under the stage near the wings." He held up a metal lemon zester, the cheap kind with little teeth in a row. On one tooth, a smear the colour of bleached celery. "Taste it, and you die," he added, and then looked apologetic. "Figure of speech." "Let us employ figures that keep us, Sergeant," Miss Marple said mildly. "A zester is a very particular instrument to leave where it will be found." "You think it was planted, or dropped?" "People who poison are tidy, for a while," Miss Marple said. "Then their tidy minds grow tired." She looked toward the schoolhouse lane. "May I ask a question you will not much like?" "I don't like most of them," he admitted. "But go on. If the dose was cumulative and last night decisive, do we know whether Mr. Ainsworth had any tincture containing digitalis in his home? Something he might have taken unadvisedly. We searched the bathroom and the cabinet with the housekeeper. No digoxin, no tinctures. His herbal nerve drops are valerian. We'll test them anyway." "Please do," Miss Marple said. "I am thinking of economy. Murderers are economical creatures when they can be." She walked on, and the village, as obliging as ever, provided the next stitch in the tapestry. Near the greengrocer's, Gwendolen Pike stood examining a pyramid of lemons with the concentration of a diplomat at a treaty. Her fingers hovered, then picked the brightest and the two most symmetrical, eyes flicking up once to see who might be watching. They met Miss Marple's and coloured. "For the choir tea," Gwendolen said too quickly. "Mrs. Breyer asked me." "How diligent of you," Miss Marple said. "Lemons do uplift the spirit. They are such honest fruit, sour when they mean to be." She took one from the pyramid and weighed it. "Tell me, my dear, when you sliced last nights, did you cut across the middle or lengthways? Some ladies prefer half moons. Others insist on rounds." "Rounds," Gwendolen said, relief at a harmless topic brightening her. "Mr. Ainsworth said rounds release the oils better." "Ah, he taught you. How kind." Miss Marple paid for her lemon and thought of teaching as a knife with two edges. At the corner, she turned toward the Pembrokes. To call uninvited is impolite, unless one has the knack of seeming invited everywhere. Mrs. Pembroke opened to her with the quick, competent smile of a woman who does not waste visitors. "You'll have heard," Miss Marple began when they were seated, "of the coroner's conclusion." "Poison," Mrs. Pembroke said, with no embroidery. "My husband is beside himself about the speculation. Every bottle in our surgery will be suspected by tea time. And unfairly, I don't doubt. I wonder, do you keep foxglove in your garden?" "Good heavens, no. Pretty, but too dangerous. We had it once, and a neighbour's child tried a bell to his lips. That was the end of that." She folded her hands, then unfolded them. "Miss Marple, you have an expression I've only ever seen on women shelling peas who know there's a pebble in the bowl." "I have lived a long time with pebbles and bowls," Miss Marple admitted. Would it be a horrible liberty to ask if you saw Mr. Ainsworth and Mr. Rudd together more often than we might suppose? Mrs. Pembroke's mouth tightened. Not displeasure, but care. I tidy the hall. I see things. Mr. Rudd spent many afternoons at Greystones these past weeks. Bringing music, they said. I am a modern woman. I believe people should share their gifts. I also think some gifts get taken. On her way out, Miss Marple paused at the small table by the door, where Mrs. Pembroke kept her vases. In one, a dried arrangement cast a mild papery shadow. Cow parsley, honesty, seed heads, and a tall spire of what had been foxglove, bleached to ghost. Mrs. Pembroke saw her look and laughed without pleasure. From a church fair hamper, I should throw it out. One invites misunderstanding if one keeps anything poisonous in the house. Understanding rarely accepts invitations, Miss Marple said. She found Mr. Rudd in his classroom again, arranging his pupils' copybooks like penitent soldiers. He looked at Miss Marple, the way people look at a mirror they'd hoped to avoid. I have been thinking, she said pleasantly, about signatures. Isn't it curious how one's hand persists, like singing with one's own throat, no matter what words one writes? He blinked. Signatures? Music, too, has its signatures, she went on. I asked myself whose hand wrote the manuscript at Greystones labelled by L.A., and why the L looked so much like an R under correction. His shoulders drew in. You examined his private papers. I looked at what a careful housekeeper placed on a public stand, Miss Marple said, quite unruffled. My dear Mr. Rudd, I thought you might save time by telling me whether your compositions had lately been confused with Mr. Ainsworth's. He said nothing, which is often when people speak most clearly. His ears reddened, his hands found each other, and then, dissatisfied, found the nearest book and squared it again. I wrote a study, he said at last, and the word came out like a confession to a minor theft. Just a thing for the children. Lionel took an interest. He said it had promise, his word, if dressed properly. Then last week he played something very like it in practice and called it his. He said he'd used my little idea as a seed. I told him seeds belong to the planter. He laughed. He had a way of laughing. Cruel men sometimes teach charity in others by accident, Miss Marple said gently. And concerning the postcard, you are a fraud, is not a phrase one hears from a choir boy. Rudd's eyes were quick with panic and then shame. I sent it. I shouldn't have. It was childish, but I wanted him to know someone new. I'd never... Mrs. Pembroke asked me this morning. You would never poison, Miss Marple finished for him. Let us agree that most men would never until they would, and then it is too late to think in absolutes. But I believe you did not. Impetuous acts have a different smell. This crime smells of patience. When she left him, he looked, not relieved, but as if he had been put back into waiting, which is its own punishment. By late afternoon, the village was rehearsing the funeral as if practicing could make it perfect. Women compared black hats, men coughed into handkerchiefs. Miss Marple returned to Greystones with a little jar of quince jelly. Consolation lives best in small glass. Mrs. Nash received her gratefully, and after a proper apology for untidiness, allowed her to carry the flowers into the music room. Miss Marple placed them on the piano. She moved them a fraction to the left to see what a fraction might reveal. It revealed dust, and under dust a faint ring on the polished surface, as if a small bottle had stood there frequently and been wiped away by someone who understands the value of wiping. Beside that ring, the greaseproof square she had noticed earlier poked its corner from the lemon basket. She lifted it delicately and turned it over on her palm. On the underside, almost invisible, a run of letters from some packaging, a chemist's name cut short, Isbury Chem, and a smudge of something pale, granular, pressed into the fold. She refolded it exactly and slid it back. Mrs. Nash, she said in a tone so casual it nearly floated, did Mr. Ainsworth ever complain of his drops tasting bitter? He said the valerian was beastly, she answered without thought. I told him to put it in lemon. He said lemon overpowered its own taste and left the valerian naked, which was his fancy way of talking. In lemon, Miss Marple repeated. Yes. At home she brewed tea and laid out a single saucer, then added a second, because one must always represent in the physical world an idea one is trying to catch. She sliced a lemon with her own sharp knife and watched the juice bead on the cut face. If one dusted powder on that face and returned the fruit to its plate, the next person to squeeze it would wash the granules obediently into the cup. A blunt knife would leave a ragged edge that excused any earlier neatness someone wished to conceal. Two sets of tongs would direct attention away from the only thing that mattered, the lemon. So simple as to be almost insulting. She thought again of the compost heap behind the hall. Foxglove leaves would be a foolish thing to display unless one were confident they pointed to everyone. The zester under the stage, too theatrical for the person she was beginning to see. No, she thought. The hand here belonged to someone who understands routines and the dignity of small tasks, who could leave an empty paper twist behind a tea tray out of habit, because tidiness lives alongside guilt, and the habit of folding is stronger than fear. Evening drew its curtains. Footsteps slowed on the pavement. Somewhere a cat leaped and landed lightly on a sill. Miss Marple rose, put on her cardigan, and went to her bureau. She wrote 3 short notes. One to Sergeant Cray, asking him to bring the paper twist to her cottage at 9 the next morning. One to Mrs. Pembroke, inviting her to call for a recipe book she had, mistakenly, lent years ago. And one to Gwendolen Pike, asking if the girl might stop by to help with a little slicing for church sandwiches. The notes were not about recipes or sandwiches. They were about hands, the way they held, folded, cut, put down and tidied away. Before bed, she stood a moment at the window. The village lay with its face composed, but she knew the look. It was the look people wear when they think they have told all the truth they intend to. The rest remained inside like a last, thin note, sustained past comfort. She would, tomorrow, let it go. The morning arrived grey and damp, the kind of weather that kept most villagers lingering indoors. But Miss Marple had always found such days useful. They slowed the pace of things, made people more inclined to sit and talk, and ensured that any caller was greeted with more curiosity than suspicion. She placed the kettle on the hob and set out her tea service, positioning the cups just so, her hands moving with the deliberate care of someone arranging the stage for a performance that had been rehearsed in her mind a dozen times. At 9:05, Sergeant Cray arrived, the paper twist in a sealed evidence envelope held, as if it might try to wriggle free. He removed his hat politely at the door and gave the sitting room a quick glance before setting the envelope on the small table beside her chair. "You wanted to see this again," he said. "Still no residue we can test, but I had it dusted. Clean as a whistle." "Of course," Miss Marple murmured, examining it through the clear plastic. "Because whoever folded it did so from habit, not fear. May I?" He nodded, and she slipped on a pair of cotton gloves from her sewing basket. She took the twist delicately, opening it just enough to study the creases, noting the way each fold was symmetrical, the edges aligned with a precision that spoke of repetition rather than haste. People who work with their hands in small, exact tasks often fold things in precisely the same way, she said softly. Sewing patterns, cake papers, or chemists' packets. Before Cray could respond, a brisk knock sounded at the door. Mrs. Pembroke entered, coat neatly buttoned, and the faintest whiff of lavender clinging to her scarf. She carried herself with the kind of energy that suggested she disliked sitting still for too long. "Good morning, Miss Marple, Sergeant," she said, glancing at the evidence on the table but making no comment. "I've brought back your recipe book. I confess I'd quite forgotten I'd borrowed it." "Easily done," Miss Marple said, accepting it with a smile. "Do sit down for a moment, my dear. You're just in time for tea." Mrs. Pembroke hesitated, whether from politeness or caution was hard to tell, but finally took the chair nearest the fire. The kettle began to hum, and Miss Marple poured, her movements unhurried, as if the conversation ahead were of no particular consequence. They, had barely settled when another knock came. This one was lighter, a little tentative. Gwendolen Pike appeared in the doorway, cheeks flushed from the damp air, clutching a small brown paper bag. "I brought the lemons you asked for, Miss Marple," she said. "From Mr. Lathbury's. He said these were the freshest." "Excellent, my dear. We shall have you slice them in a moment." She ushered Gwendolen to the table, setting a small board and a knife before her. Miss Marple had chosen the blunt kitchen knife she almost never used, its edge worn from years of service, and watched as Gwendolen took it up automatically in her right hand. "Rounds, please," Miss Marple said, "as you did for Mr. Ainsworth, and mind the thickness. Consistency is the mark of a good hostess." Gwendolen began slicing, each movement deliberate, her tongue caught lightly between her teeth in concentration. The blunt knife required more pressure, and Miss Marple observed how she compensated, pressing down hard, letting the blade wobble just slightly before the cut went through. Mrs. Pembroke, meanwhile, had taken out her handkerchief and was folding it in neat halves, then quarters, the corners meeting perfectly. The motion was unconscious, her fingers moving with the same exactitude as the folds in the paper twist lying on the table between them. "Sergeant," Miss Marple said suddenly, "would you hand Mrs. Pembroke that evidence packet? I believe she may recognize the folding." Mrs. Pembroke looked momentarily startled, then reached for it with the same ease she had shown with the handkerchief, her fingers aligning the packet almost without thought. "It's neatly done," she said. "Chemists used to fold powders like this when I was a girl. My aunt had an apothecary in Bath. She showed me how, though I've not used the skill in years." Miss Marple's smile was pleasant, but her eyes did not waver. "And yet, when one learns such things young, the hands remember, don't they? I imagine they could fold such a packet in the dark." Mrs. Pembroke's composure shifted by a hair's breadth, just enough to suggest that she had understood the direction of the remark. She set the packet back on the table, her movements careful. Gwendolen, oblivious to the undercurrent, laid out the lemon slices on a plate, the pale yellow crescents glistening with juice. Miss Marple took one between her fingers, turning it slightly so that the juice caught the light. "It occurs to me," she said lightly, "that a powder placed here would dissolve entirely in hot tea, and that a man accustomed to lemon in the evening might never suspect." Cray leaned forward. "You're suggesting—" "I'm suggesting that whoever prepared Mr. Ainsworth's tea last night had the opportunity to place a prepared slice in his cup, one already dusted from another location. A blunt knife could disguise the earlier cut, and 2 sets of tongs might ensure the slice was chosen without undue attention." She placed the lemon back on the plate. The paper twist could have held the powder until moments before, and only someone both precise and confident in such folding would tuck it away, empty, behind the tea tray, out of sight, but not destroyed. Mrs. Pembroke's gaze flicked to the window, then back to Miss Marple. "You believe I did this?" "I believe," Miss Marple said softly, "that you knew more about Mr. Ainsworth's habits than most. As the doctor's wife, you could obtain small quantities of digitalis without raising questions, and you had reason to dislike him, if, as I suspect, he had threatened to expose some indiscretion involving your husband's practice, perhaps a prescription written too freely, or a favour granted to the wrong patient." Colour rose in Mrs. Pembroke's cheeks. "You speak as though you've proof." "I leave proof to the police," Miss Marple said. "But I've lived long enough to recognise the difference between an accident and an arrangement, and last night's arrangement was most certainly deliberate." The room was very quiet, save for the ticking of the mantel clock. Gwendolen looked from one face to another, her hands still resting on the board. Mrs. Pembroke stood abruptly, smoothing her skirt. "If you have questions, Sergeant, I suggest you put them to me formally." "I will," Cray said, though he glanced at Miss Marple with something like reluctant admiration. When Mrs. Pembroke had gone, Gwendolen exhaled in a rush. "I don't understand. Why would she—" "Because, my dear," Miss Marple said gently, "the motives for such acts are often not grand, but petty. Pride, resentment, fear of disgrace, these weigh heavily on some people And once the balance tips, they will do the one thing they swore they'd never do. She gathered up the lemon plate and carried it to the kitchen, her back straight, her step measured. Cray lingered, tapping the packet lightly against his palm. "You've given me a path, Miss Marple. I'll walk it. But I'd like to know, when did you first suspect her?" "When I saw the fold," she said simply. "There are few things in life as revealing as the way a person's hands move when they believe no one is watching." Outside, the damp air pressed close, and the village went on with its ordinary noises. The rattle of a milk cart, the murmur of voices at the shop, unaware, for the moment, that the long, sustained note of suspicion was about to resolve into its final chord. Sergeant Cray left just before midday, the paper twist tucked back into its envelope, his jaw set in that half-determined, half-wary way she had seen in policemen when they were close to acting, but not yet ready to put their hand on the shoulder. Miss Marple watched him go from her window, then turned back to clear the tea things. Gwendolen still lingered, as if unsure whether she was part of something important or merely an onlooker who had stumbled into a private conversation. "You slice neatly," Miss Marple said, taking the board from her. "A good skill, though I think you've been taught to press a little too hard. Did Mr. Ainsworth instruct you so?" Gwendolen coloured. "He said a clean cut looked refined. I wanted to, well, please him. Everyone did, really. He had a way of making you feel noticed." "Yes," Miss Marple said, drying the knife. "And some people can't bear to lose that kind of attention once they've had it." She laid the knife in its place, her tone as mild as if they had been speaking of seed cake. "Be careful, my dear, that you never find yourself in debt to a person who trades in approval." When Gwendolen had gone, the cottage was quiet, except for the slow tick of the clock. Miss Marple took her knitting, but found her fingers idle. Her mind was turning over the pieces again, smoothing their edges. She could see now how it had been done. The patient accumulation of digitalis, masked in a habit no one questioned, the final dose prepared away from view and slipped into the expected moment. The neat folding of the paper twist was as telling as a fingerprint, perhaps more so, for it spoke not only of identity but of mindset, the tidy hand that could place a weapon almost lovingly among the tools of hospitality. The next step, she knew, was for Cray to confirm his case. Without her saying so, he would check the Pembroke surgery, perhaps discreetly ask about any missing tablets or tinctures. He would need a statement, calm, reasoned, and without hint of the emotion that still rippled under Mrs. Pembroke's composure this morning. But police work is a matter of doors and keys. Miss Marple's work was to know which door the key must fit before the lock was even seen. In the afternoon she walked to the vicarage, ostensibly to consult about the flower arrangements for the funeral. Reverend Latham greeted her with warmth and a mild worry that seemed to have deepened over the last 2 days. They sat in his study, the faint smell of old paper and tobacco in the air. "I've been thinking, Miss Marple," he began, "about how swiftly things unravel. One moment a concert, such a small joy for the village, and the next all is suspicion and shadow." "It is often so," she said. "A death in public view unsettles the balance. But tell me, how well do you know Mrs. Pembroke?" The vicar considered. "She is capable, respected, some might say protective. Of her husband, certainly, and of her own reputation. It has been whispered, though I dislike passing on such talk, that Lionel once threatened to bring a complaint to the medical board. The matter was never spoken of openly, but I suspect it related to a prescription given rather too freely." "Such a thing could ruin a practice," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle, but her mind noting that the motive sat there in plain view, like a bird on a branch. Leaving the vicarage, she crossed paths with Mr. Rudd, who seemed more drawn than before, as though the weight of suspicion had been resting lightly on him and was only now lifting. He stopped, glancing around to make sure they were unobserved. "Sergeant Cray spoke to me again," he said. "Asked more about the manuscript. I told him the truth, that Lionel had taken my work. I suppose I suppose that makes me look bitter. Bitterness is not the same as murder, Mr. Rudd, Miss Marple said, but you are wise to answer plainly. The truth has a way of sounding right, even to those who would prefer it otherwise. As the day wore on, the village seemed to hold its breath. People gathered in twos at shop doors, conversations breaking off when someone passed. By evening, word had spread, though not from Miss Marple, that Sergeant Cray had visited the Pembrokes again. The lamps in their front room glowed late into the night. The following morning, Cray appeared at her gate earlier than she expected. His expression carried the satisfaction of a man whose suspicions had just acquired the shape of fact. "We found powder digitalis in a small jar at the surgery," he said without preamble. "Labelled as heart medication, but no patient on their list is prescribed it. And the chemist in St. Mary Mead remembers supplying a small amount to Dr. Pembroke last month. For study purposes, apparently. Mrs. Pembroke claims she didn't know of it, but the jar was in her sewing basket, tucked under the folded linens." Miss Marple's needles paused. In her sewing basket. Yes. A place for small, exact things, kept out of sight but within reach. "She's not speaking much now," Cray went on. "Says she wants a solicitor, but we've enough to hold her." Miss Marple looked down at her knitting, the soft grey wool pooling in her lap. "She will say she acted to protect her husband. Perhaps she even believes it, but there is more to it. Pride, the refusal to be shamed, the certainty that she could manage the matter herself. These things, Sergeant, are the quiet architects of many tragedies." When he had gone, she sat for a long time, her hands still. Outside, the village was returning to its routines, though with the subdued air of people adjusting to a new absence. The concert would be spoken of for years, not for the music, but for the moment when the note had lasted too long, and the man at the piano had looked suddenly, fleetingly afraid. In her mind, she replayed that instant again. The flicker on Lionel's face, the hesitation in the music, the slight turn of his head toward the tea table. Even then, she thought, he might have known. Not the who, perhaps, but the that of it. The sense that something, or someone, had altered the evening's course in a way that could not be undone. By late afternoon, the sky had cleared to a thin blue. Miss Marple stepped into her garden, clipping the last of the roses before the frost came. The air was cold on her cheeks, but there was a kind of peace in the ordered beds and the neat rows of winter cabbages. People often thought solving a murder was about unmasking the culprit. It was not. It was about restoring the pattern, setting right what had been thrown askew so that life could go on, if not as before, then at least without the jagged edge of unanswered questions. As she gathered the roses into a small jug for her kitchen table, she heard the distant toll of the church bell, slow and deliberate. It would be for Lionel Ainsworth's funeral tomorrow. The village would come, some out of respect, some out of curiosity, and some because they could not resist the pull of a shared ending. Mrs. Pembroke would not be among them. Her absence would be noticed, whispered about, folded neatly into the ongoing story the village told about itself. Miss Marple carried the roses inside and set them in their place. She put the kettle on, took down her cup, and allowed herself the small satisfaction of knowing that, in the quiet way she preferred, the matter was closed. The long note had finally resolved, fading into silence, and the village could, for now, return to its gentler music. The day of Lionel Ainsworth's funeral dawned pale and brittle, the kind of cold that pinched the skin and made breath hang briefly in the air before vanishing. The churchyard was already dotted with dark coats when Miss Marple arrived, her step measured on the frost-hardened path. She took a seat halfway down the aisle, where she could observe both the pulpit and the faces that turned one by one toward the door each time it opened. Mrs. Pembroke's absence was, as she had predicted, the first thing noticed. Two matrons whispered behind their gloved hands. A young man at the back shook his head as if to dismiss something disagreeable, and Mrs. Evans leaned toward the vicar's wife with a murmur that carried just enough to reach Miss Marple's ear. "She's not here, of course. Poor Dr. Pembroke. The service was dignified and brief. Reverend Latham spoke of Lionel's contribution to village life, of music as a gift to be shared, and of the suddenness with which life's melody can be cut short. There was no mention of the investigation, but the unspoken truth lay like a shadow on the pews. When the organist began the recessional, a restrained, almost cautious rendition of Bach, Miss Marple noticed Gwendolen Pike's face crumple just slightly, her hand tightening on her hymn book. Outside, the air was sharper. People formed small knots, offering the usual condolences, which in a village always carry the weight of a dozen other conversations. Miss Marple allowed herself to be drawn into one such group, listening as Mrs. Briar recounted, for the third time, her memory of handing Lionel his tea. Each telling grew more certain in detail, though Miss Marple knew from long experience that certainty after the fact was often the most misleading quality of all. She made her way slowly toward the gate, intending to return home, but found Gwendolen lingering near the low wall, her gaze unfocused. "A sad day, my dear," Miss Marple said, drawing close enough that the girl startled a little. "It is," Gwendolen replied. "I keep thinking about the concert, about things I might have done differently." "Remorse is a heavy coat to wear," Miss Marple said. "Better to hang it up once you've taken from its pockets all that might be useful." Gwendolen hesitated, then said, "I didn't tell Sergeant Cray everything, not because I wanted to hide anything, but because I thought it didn't matter. Now I'm not so sure." Miss Marple's expression invited her to go on. "When I came into the green room with the lemons, Mrs. Pembroke was there. She was near the side table, folding something. She tucked it into her bag before anyone else came in. I thought it was just a napkin. But it could have been—" She glanced around, lowering her voice. "It could have been that paper packet you spoke of." Miss Marple nodded slowly, not in surprise but in quiet affirmation. It is often the way that what seems small at the time proves to be the hinge on which the whole door swings. She left Gwendolen with a kind word and walked home through the lanes, her mind already turning over the implications. It was not confirmation. She already had that in the fold of the paper twist and the presence of the digitalis. But it was a thread that, once pulled, would unravel the last of Mrs. Pembroke's denials. That afternoon, Sergeant Cray came by again, the weariness in his face edged with relief. "She's admitted it," he said without preamble. "Not to the whole thing, mind, but enough. Said she acted alone, that her husband knew nothing. She claims she only meant to make him unwell, her words, so he'd think twice before carrying out his threat. But the dose was too strong. She says she panicked." "Poisoners often speak of panic afterward," Miss Marple said. "The planning is deliberate, but the result, when it comes, always feels like something that happened to them, not something they did." Cray sat down heavily. "I suppose it will go to trial soon enough. I wanted to thank you, Miss Marple. Without your particular way of noticing things, we might still be chasing half the village in circles." She smiled faintly. "You give me too much credit. People show you what they are, Sergeant, if you know how to watch the hands and not just the face." When he had gone, the cottage felt quieter than usual, though the ticking clock and the faint hiss of the kettle on the hob kept it from silence. Miss Marple settled into her chair with her knitting, her thoughts drifting not to the case just concluded, but to the patterns it echoed. How pride, fear, and the small desire to keep one's place in the eyes of others could lead so steadily towards destruction. The next day, the village had already begun to turn the story into something more palatable. Mrs. Evans spoke of Mrs. Pembroke's delicate nerves, implying that stress had unbalanced her. Mrs. Briar, whose account of the green room was now on its fourth revision, had begun to suggest that perhaps Lionel's health had been failing for years. Even the vicar, in quiet conversation, remarked that judgment must be tempered with compassion. The truth, Miss Marple knew, would soon be folded neatly into the fabric of village life, its sharper edges smoothed away until it became just another cautionary tale to be retold at suitable moments. That evening, she walked to the churchyard alone. The grave was fresh, the mound neat, a small spray of white chrysanthemums at its head. She stood a while, thinking not of Lionel's failings, which were many, nor of Mrs. Pembroke's guilt, which was certain, but of the moment in the concert when the note had lingered too long. She had seen the fear then, sudden, private and irrevocable, and known that something was out of place. As she turned to leave, a faint sound carried from the open door of the church, the organist practicing, a slow, careful run of notes. They rose and fell, each held just long enough, none longer than it should be. It was, she thought, a fitting end, not dramatic, not rushed, but in its proper place, allowing the piece to end as it was meant to. Back at her cottage, she lit the lamp and drew the curtains against the night. The roses on the table had begun to droop, their heads heavy, petals loosening one by one. She would replace them tomorrow. For now, she poured herself a cup of tea, added a thin round of lemon, and watched the steam curl upward. Outside, the village carried on in its usual way, the long, discordant note of suspicion at last resolved into the steady hum of ordinary life. In the days that followed, the frost deepened, and the village seemed to tuck itself inward, the way people draw their collars close against a chill they cannot quite shake. The Pembroke matter, though officially in the hands of the law, lingered in low conversations outside the post office and in the pauses between purchases at the grocer's. Miss Marple, moving through these small gatherings with her usual gentle presence, noted how quickly certainty had softened into speculation, and speculation into the comfortable half-truths a community prefers. Mrs. Pembroke, now lodged in the county jail, was spoken of as either a tragic figure undone by pressure or a cold-blooded schemer whose mask had finally slipped. Both portraits were incomplete, but neither entirely untrue. One morning, Miss Marple received a letter delivered by Mrs. Evans herself, who lingered in the doorway as if expecting to be asked in. The envelope bore the Pembroke surgery's crest, and a hand that was unmistakably the doctor's, upright, careful, with just enough flourish to be genteel, without appearing vain. Miss Marple invited Mrs. Evans in for tea, and only when they were settled did she open it. It was a short note, written in the strained politeness of a man trying to hold together dignity and distress. Dr. Pembroke thanked her for her kindness to my wife in these most unfortunate circumstances, and expressed a wish to speak with her privately before the week was out. There was no mention of the charge, nor of his own position in the matter, but the undercurrent of the words carried a certain weight, an anxiety not about the outcome, but about the manner in which the truth would sit when the trial was done. She walked to the surgery that afternoon, the sky low and colourless, a thin wind sliding under the eaves. Dr. Pembroke met her in his consulting room, a place that smelled faintly of antiseptic and camphor. He looked older than she remembered from the concert. The lines at the corners of his eyes deepened, his hair less orderly. "I suppose," he began, after they had exchanged the necessary pleasantries, "you know as much as anyone about what has happened." "I know enough," Miss Marple said, "and enough to understand that there are always more layers to a matter than one sees at first." He nodded, glancing down at his hands. "My wife believes she acted for my sake. That is, not untrue. But there is more to it. Lionel had threatened to make public a certain mistake I made. Not out of malice, I think, but out of a kind of superiority. He enjoyed holding such things over people. I told her I could manage it, that I would speak to him directly. She chose another path. I cannot condone it, but I cannot wholly condemn her either." Miss Marple regarded him with that mild, steady look which so often encouraged confidences. "You feel responsible?" "Of course I do, but in this village—" He trailed off, as if the rest were too delicate to voice. "In this village," she finished for him, "responsibility and blame are not easily separated, and forgiveness, once given, is rarely spoken of again, which makes it all the harder to reach. They spoke for a little while longer, and when she left, she carried with her not new facts, but a clearer sense of the currents beneath the surface. The Pembrokes' marriage had been one of mutual protection, she guarding his reputation, he guarding her place in the social fabric. Lionel's intrusion into that balance had been less about what he threatened to reveal, and more about the way he had unbalanced the careful symmetry they had built. That evening, as she sat by the fire with her knitting, a knock came at the door. It was Gwendolen Pike, looking less certain than she had at the funeral. She held out a small parcel, wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. "I found this among my music things," she said. It's a program from a concert in Bath, years ago. Mr. Ainsworth's name is on it, but so is someone else's. R. Rudd. I thought perhaps it might matter." Miss Marple took it, unwrapping it with care. The program was faded, the ink slightly smudged at the edges, but the names were clear enough. Beside one of the listed pieces, 3 country studies, was a note in a different hand. Adapted from R.R. She looked up at Gwendolen, who shifted under her gaze. "I didn't know he had played with Mr. Rudd before," the girl said. "But Mr. Rudd never mentioned it. Maybe he forgot." "Or maybe," Miss Marple said, "he preferred not to remember." After Gwendolen had gone, she set the program beside her chair, her mind knitting together this thread with the others. Lionel's habit of taking credit where it was not due had not been limited to the present. Rudd's resentment had deep roots, though it had borne no poisonous fruit in this case. But the history explained the sharpness in his tone, the way his eyes had shifted when she first mentioned the manuscript at Greystones. The next day, she called on Rudd under the pretext of returning a book. She found him at his desk, marking papers, his expression guarded. When she placed the program before him, he stared at it for a long moment. "I'd forgotten this," he said at last, "or told myself I had. He asked me to play with him once before he moved here, said it would be good for me. Then he used one of my pieces without credit. I thought, well, it was only a trifle, and he had more to lose than I did, but it stayed with me." "Some grievances," Miss Marple said, "do not fade. They simply wait for the right light to be seen again." He looked up sharply, but she offered only a mild smile and rose to go. She had no more questions for him. The point was not to accuse, but to ensure that all the pieces of the picture were in their places before the frame was fixed for good. By the week's end, the Pembroke case had shifted from active investigation to preparation for trial. The village, restless without the daily trickle of new revelations, turned its attention to smaller matters. A missing chicken from Mrs. Bryer's coop, an argument about hymn choices for Christmas, the annual rumour that snow would come early this year. Miss Marple moved among these conversations with quiet ease, her mind no longer on the puzzle itself, but on the way it had played out, how a single sustained note, noticed by chance, had opened into a whole melody of deceit, pride, and misplaced loyalty. On Sunday, she attended the evening service. The organist, perhaps unconsciously, chose a hymn with a long, lingering final chord. As the sound filled the church, Miss Marple found herself remembering the concert, the way Lionel's expression had changed in that instant, the lemon slice waiting in his tea. The connection between the two moments was no longer sharp, but it would not entirely fade. Such things never did. When the hymn ended, she closed her book and sat a moment longer than the rest, letting the silence settle around her. Outside, the cold had deepened, and the first flakes of snow began to fall, soft and soundless, covering the cobbles and the graves alike. By morning, the village would wear its winter mask, clean and unbroken, as if no discord had ever disturbed its quiet tune. But Miss Marple knew better. Patterns did not disappear. They simply waited beneath the surface, ready to be seen again by those who knew how to look. Snow lay across the village like a clean sheet, smoothing away the marks of recent days, though Miss Marple knew the prints beneath were still there for anyone who cared to look. The rooftops wore white caps, the hedgerows were softened into gentle mounds, and the high street had taken on that hushed quality that makes people lower their voices without realizing why. It was the sort of weather that seemed to insist on calm, and yet she could sense a restlessness under the surface, as though the village itself knew a chapter was not quite finished. She had intended a quiet day, knitting by the fire, a pot of tea within reach, but a knock at the door shortly after 10 made her set her work aside. Sergeant Cray stood on the step, his boots marked with the clean-edged cuts of snow from the lane. His expression was thoughtful, not grim, but the sort of thoughtful that told her the matter at hand was not entirely settled. "I've been to the county," he said as she showed him in. "Mrs. Pembroke's solicitor has put forward a statement. She's insisting she acted alone, yes, but now she's saying Lionel wasn't her only concern. According to her, he'd been asking questions about someone else here, someone he meant to embarrass." Miss Marple poured him tea without comment, letting him arrange the rest in his own time. He accepted the cup, took a sip, and continued. "She wouldn't say who. Claims she doesn't want to ruin another life. Her words. But it's odd, don't you think? If she was determined to protect her husband, why muddy it with this new piece?" "Because," Miss Marple said mildly, "she knows the picture painted of her is too simple. A woman who kills for her husband's sake may be seen as misguided but loyal. A woman who kills to protect someone else entirely invites other interpretations. She may hope to shift the light without changing the shape of the figure." Craig grunted, setting down his cup. "It makes me wonder if there's a thread we've missed." Miss Marple did not answer at once. She thought of the programme Gwendolen had brought, of Rudd's quiet bitterness, of the hints that Lionel's interference in other lives had not been confined to music. "There are always more threads, Sergeant," she said at last. "The question is whether pulling them will mend the cloth or unravel it further." After he left, she sat a while in her chair, the snow-bright light from the window making the room seem sharper. If Mrs. Pembroke had been protecting another, the circle of possibilities was not large. Lionel's reach in the village had been wide enough to touch egos and tempers, but true harm required a certain closeness. She thought of Gwendolen's flushed eagerness, of Mr. Rudd's resentment, of Mrs. Briar's bustling presence in every corner of the concert hall. And she thought, too, of Dr. Pembroke's guarded mention of Lionel's fondness for holding things over people. Not for money, not for gain, but for the quiet satisfaction of control. By afternoon, the snow had begun to thaw in patches, revealing the dark earth beneath. Miss Marple decided to walk to the post office, knowing Mrs. Evans was a better source of village currents than any official channel. She found her behind the counter, a wool scarf wound high about her neck. "Cold walk for you, Miss Marple," Mrs. Evans said, reaching for the letter to be posted. "News travels even in snow, though. Heard the Pembroke woman's changing her story." "So I understand," Miss Marple said. "She suggests Lionel was troubling someone else." Mrs. Evans leaned forward. "If you ask me, and I know you haven't, my guess is that it's that music teacher. Mr. Rudd's not said much, but I've seen him go pale when Lionel's name came up, and young Gwendolen's been avoiding him, which is odd after all those lessons." Miss Marple gave a small nod of thanks and stepped back into the lane. It was not a confirmation, but it aligned with the shape of her thoughts. On impulse, she took the path toward the schoolhouse. She found Rudd in the small music room, seated at the piano with a stack of exercise books beside him. He looked up quickly when she entered. "I've been thinking," she said without preamble, "about what Lionel might have had on you." His mouth tightened. "If you've come to accuse me—" "I've come," she interrupted gently, "to suggest that whatever he held, it was enough for Mrs. Pembroke to think you worth protecting. She may have disliked you. She may have had no reason beyond her own sense of tidiness. But you should know her story now includes you, whether she names you or not." He stared at her, colour rising to his cheeks. "It was nothing criminal. Just, he knew about a job I applied for in Bath before I came here. said he could give a character reference if he chose. The position went to someone else. I always suspected. He broke off, his hand falling on the keys with a dull chord. If Mrs. Pembroke thinks that's reason to, well, it's absurd. Absurd or not, Miss Marple said, you should be prepared. Stories have a way of bending to fit the teller's needs. When she left, the sky was already shading toward dusk. She walked home slowly, her mind settling into the familiar rhythm of arranging facts. Mrs. Pembroke's new angle might be genuine, a final attempt to shield another from Lionel's petty cruelty. Or it might be calculated, a way to muddy the waters before trial. Either way, the practical work of the thing was done. The truth, as far as it could be known, had been laid out. What remained was the tidying up, the gentle resettling of the village into its old patterns. That evening, she lit her lamp and took up her knitting again. The fire crackled softly, the snow outside reflected a pale glow through the curtains. She thought of the concert, of the lingering note, of the flicker of fear on Lionel's face. In a way, that was where the whole affair had begun. Not with the poison, not with the motive, but with that instant when something in the air changed and only a few were listening closely enough to hear it. She finished her row, smoothed the yarn, and allowed herself the small satisfaction of knowing that in her own quiet way she had listened. And that had been enough. The first signs of spring came early that year. Snowdrops along the church wall, a faint green wash on the hedgerows. But in Chipping Dean, the winter's events still clung in quieter ways. People spoke less freely of the Pembrokes now. Polite acknowledgements replaced speculation, and the sharp edges of gossip had been filed down to a sort of respectful avoidance. Mrs. Pembroke remained in custody, her trial set for the summer assizes. Dr. Pembroke continued his practice with a quieter manner. The proud tilt of his head now softened, as if he knew the village had seen more of his life than he would have wished. Miss Marple's own life had returned to its calm rhythms. Letters to answer, friends to visit, her garden to ready for the season. But there were still occasional visits from Sergeant Cray. On one such afternoon, he came in without the usual air of news to deliver. "It's all tied up now," he said, settling into the armchair opposite her. "She's confessed fully. No more changes to the story. She admits she feared Lionel's hold over her husband and, oddly enough, over Rudd as well. Says she couldn't bear the thought of the man ruining two reputations just for the pleasure of it." Miss Marple poured the tea, and so she did the one thing that would end his reach entirely. I said she measured the powder herself, folded it into the packet, and brought it to the hall that night. Waited for the right moment, slipped it into the lemon slice while she was helping at the tea table. Smooth as anything by her account. He shook his head. She even admitted to folding the paper twist neatly and tucking it away. Habit, she said. Couldn't bear to leave it lying untidy. That, Miss Marple said with a faint smile, was what gave her away from the start. You see, Sergeant, most crimes leave a mess, something out of place. But the tidy crimes, they leave everything too much in place, and that is just as telling. Cray sipped his tea. Funny thing is, I think most of the village will forgive her sooner or later. Not because they think she was right, but because they'll tell themselves they might have done the same, given the provocation. They will, Miss Marple agreed, and they will fold that belief away in their minds, neat as any chemist's packet, to be brought out only when they need it. When he had gone, she walked to the window. Outside, the snowdrops trembled in a light breeze, and somewhere in the distance, a piano was being played, haltingly, as if the player were practicing alone. She thought of the concert night, the soft pedal sticking, the note that had lasted too long, and the moment when she had seen Lionel's face change. That single instant, observed and remembered, had been the thread that led her through the tangle. It was always the same in the end. Not a flash of brilliance, but the quiet accumulation of small human details, the way hands folded paper, the way a knife cut lemon, the way fear flickered and was hidden. Those were the true signatures, and they never lied. She turned back to her chair, set the kettle on for one last cup, and let the fire's warmth fill the room. Outside, the village was returning to its own music, steady and unremarkable, as if no discord had ever touched it. But she knew better. Beneath the melody, there was always another note, softer, longer, waiting for the ear that could hear it.